The morning she baked bread was the morning they came to kill her. She had known they were coming for 3 days. She had smelled them, the particular chemical signature of Veth military-grade suit polymers carried on the thin wind that blew down from the ridge at dawn, mixed with the copper-sweet taint of fear suppressants that young soldiers took before operations. She had known by the pattern of their surveillance drones, which changed course twice in 48 hours in the way drones only changed course when the operators were debating something instead of executing orders. She had known because she had written the protocols that governed drone surveillance in contested territories, and she recognized the hesitation built into a system designed by a military that was very good at following plans and very bad at changing them. She baked bread anyway. The old iron stove in the back of the stall was a human thing. She had found it in the ruins of the first settlement, half buried under collapsed prefab panels, its enamel cracked along one side where something had struck it hard during the bombardment of what the Veth still called the Reclamation, and what the people who had lived through it called something they tended not to say out loud around anyone with a Veth administrative badge. She had carried the stove herself, all 3 kilometers back to the market district of what was now called New Veth Reclamation Zone 7, though the human settlers who still lived in the lower quarter called it Dustside, same as they always had, and the Orc workers who drifted through on seasonal labor permits called it by a word in their own language that translated, approximately, as the place that stayed. The stove weighed 200 kilograms. She had carried it in one arm. Nobody had asked why. Nobody asked the old woman much of anything. That was the arrangement, and it had worked for 11 years. She was called Mora. She sold bread from a canvas stall at the end of the 3rd market row, between a Veth-licensed spice merchant, who was always just barely compliant with the zone's commercial regulations, and a crumbling wall that had once been the exterior of a human community center. The bread was good, better than anything else in the market, better than the nutrient-optimized product that came out of the Veth food dispensary on the north side of the zone, which was efficient and filling, and had the texture of compressed regret. Mora's bread was made with a starter culture that had been alive for longer than some of the alien administrators who signed her operating permit had been born. It had weight and crust, and a yeasty sourness that people came back for, which was why she had been given her permit in the first place. The zone administrator had tried her bread once and renewed the permit without reviewing the original application, which was the kind of administrative oversight Mora had counted on. She charged 3 chips for a standard loaf, 2 for a roll, and gave away the ends of the day's baking to whoever was still hanging around at dusk. The human children from the lower quarter came specifically for the ends. She knew all their names. She knew their families, their complaints, the small hierarchies and negotiations that governed their days. In 11 years, she had learned the shape of a settlement the way you can only learn it by being a fixed point within it. The way a market stall becomes a kind of anchor, a place people return to not only for bread, but for the continuity of a thing that stays when other things don't. She was, to all observation, an old woman selling bread. She was 412 years old. She was 5 feet and 4 inches tall in her leather shoes, which were the kind of shoes you find in a market district, handmade by someone in the lower quarter who did good work and charged fairly. She had gray hair she wore braided back from her face, and a face that was creased and weathered in the way of someone who had spent decades in hard environments, which she had, though the hard environments in question would have been recognizable to a historian and deeply uncomfortable for anyone in the administrative chain of Zone 7. Her eyes were black and very still and watched everything without apparent effort, the way still water watches whatever passes over it. She had hands that were large and scarred in ways that did not quite match the biography of an old woman who had spent her life at a bread stall. The scars were old, most of them pale against her dark skin, with the particular healed flat texture that came from wounds that had been serious, but had been treated by someone who knew what they were doing. The largest scar crossed her left palm diagonally, and there was a crescent-shaped notch between the second and third knuckle of her left hand, where a blade had caught her at an angle that would have taken the fingers of anyone who hadn't had the reflexes to rotate their wrist in time. Nobody in the market district looked at hands anymore. Looking too closely at anything was how you got noticed by the Veth administrators, and getting noticed was how you ended up reassigned to a processing settlement on one of the outer moons, which were cold and airless and had no bread at all. She was called in the oldest Veth military archives, the ones that had been sealed, reclassified once, and sealed again with a level of security clearance that exceeded what most zone administrators had access to in their entire careers, the Granite Throne, the Unbroken Queen, War Chief of the Orc Confederation's combined military forces, architect of the 14-year expansion, commander at the fall of Kelsaris, where the Veth's third-largest military installation had been taken in 11 days with a ground force that was, by standard military accounting, one-third the size it should have taken to do the job. The officer who had designed the siege of the Radiant Chain, which had held the Veth homeworld's primary moon in blockade for 2 years and 3 months, and brought the entirety of the Veth Empire, 700 populated systems, 11 subjugated species, a military-industrial apparatus that had been dominant in this region of space for 4 centuries, to the negotiating table. She had won that negotiation. She had won most things she set her mind to. She was, by any reasonable measure, the most dangerous living entity within 400 light years. She put the first loaves in the oven and set the timer on the cracked display screen above the vent, and then she went to check on Bot. Bot was older than the stove. He had been part of the original human science station that predated the settlement by almost 30 years, an unmanned research installation that had been placed on Kessler's world for reasons that involved the planet's unique atmospheric chemistry, and had subsequently been forgotten when the funding body that commissioned it was absorbed by a larger funding body that had different priorities. Bot was a maintenance unit, designed for routine facility upkeep, and he had spent approximately 2 decades maintaining a facility that had no occupants, running his diagnostic cycles and repairing what needed repairing, and presumably waiting, though whether an automaton could wait in any meaningful sense was a question Mora had stopped being certain she knew the answer to after spending 11 years in his company. He stood about 3 feet tall and moved on 4 jointed legs, each ending in a pad that was designed to grip metal grating, and had adapted with reasonable success to the packed earth floor of the stall. He had a single manipulator arm that worked at approximately 60% capacity due to corrosion in the shoulder joint that Mora had never been able to fully repair, partly because the parts were discontinued, and partly because Bot had expressed, in his flat diagnostic way, that he had adjusted his operational protocols to compensate, and did not wish to undergo the degree of disassembly that a full repair would require. She had respected this. He spoke in a dry, flat voice, calibrated to deliver maintenance status reports to empty rooms, and had been pressed into general conversation through 11 years of proximity. He had learned over those years something that she could only describe as tact, not in the human sense, which involved affect and social awareness, but in the mechanical sense of knowing when the most useful thing to say was nothing, and when not saying anything was its own kind of failure. She found him at the edge of the stall's back wall, running a diagnostic on the water recycler that kept the dough hydrated in the dry planetary air. This was a world with very little free water, which was part of why the human settlers had stayed. It was marginal land, and marginal land was the kind of land that didn't attract the full weight of administrative attention. "You have 12 unacknowledged perimeter alerts," Bot said, without looking up from the recycler. "I know. The Eastern approach shows thermal signatures consistent with 6 to 8 armored personnel. Veth military-grade environmental suits, configuration consistent with reclamation enforcement rather than standard military. The distinction is relevant because reclamation enforcement operates under administrative rather than military command structure, which affects the orders they're likely to be carrying. 7 personnel, she said. There's a 7th hiding behind the grain storage unit near the West Road, separate position from the main group, probably the commanding officer. They always position the commanding officer separately so that if the primary unit encounters resistance, the CO can call for backup rather than becoming a casualty. Standard reclamation doctrine since the reforms of 43 standard years ago. Bot processed this. You know when the doctrine changed. I wrote a strategic analysis that recommended against the change, she said. I wrote it for the Orc Confederation's intelligence division, which shared it with the VETH via a neutral intermediary as part of the pre-accords information exchange. The VETH Strategic Command disagreed with my analysis and implemented the doctrine change anyway. They were wrong, but they had the authority to be wrong, so. Another pause. Are we going to run? She looked at him. Over the years, she had learned to read something in the arrangement of his optical arrays, something she could only call expression, though she knew it was pattern recognition on her part, the same tendency Bot himself likely had when he processed her face. Right now he looked, in his flat and limited way, worried. No, she said. The last time you stayed instead of running, Bot said, was at Kelsaris. I know. The casualty records from Kelsaris are significant. I know what the casualty records are, she said. I wrote most of them. She touched the side of his chassis with 2 fingers in the light way she had developed over years of the same gesture. It was not comfort exactly. It was acknowledgement. Go inside, keep the timer running. Don't let the bread burn. Bot stood for a moment longer. His optical clusters made a small adjustment, refocusing, she thought, on something he didn't have the language to say. Then he turned and walked back into the stall on his 4 careful legs, and Mora turned to face the market district in the early morning light. It was a low-angle light, the kind that made everything in the market district look flatter than it was, the awnings, the canvas stalls, the patchwork of prefab structures and salvaged materials that made up the lower quarters architecture. The world had a slightly pinkish sky at dawn, the particular atmospheric effect of its mineral content that had nothing to do with Mars and everything to do with the fact that dust got into the air and stayed there. The human settlers called the color home. The VETH administrators called it aesthetically deficient in their facility reports. These were the kinds of observations that told you everything you needed to know about a relationship. A Vel-class merchant was arranging bolts of synthetic fabric 3 stalls down. 2 human children, she was almost certain their names were Senna, and the small one they all called Patch, were chasing something through the gap between stalls, at the volume and enthusiasm of children who have not yet learned that they are supposed to be careful about joy. The smell of the morning was dust, and the neighbors' spices, and the early warmth building in the plastic panels, and from her own stall, bread. She had stood in this market on hundreds of mornings. She had watched children grow from the gap-running stage to the stage where they apprenticed in trades and began making careful adult faces. She had watched the VETH administration change 3 zone administrators and update its signage twice, and modify its operating permit requirements in ways that added forms without reducing paperwork. She had watched the community center's exterior wall lose another section to structural fatigue and nobody coming to repair it. She had watched all of it the way a fixed point watches things pass around it. The soldiers came from 2 directions at once, which was textbook VETH encirclement doctrine for a potentially high-value apprehension. She had studied this doctrine, adapted elements of it, and used the adapted version against VETH reclamation units during the 2nd phase of the Eastern expansion, with results that had subsequently been classified at the highest available level. 7 of them, as she had counted, in the matte gray environmental suits with amber visor tinting that marked reclamation enforcement. The suits were good equipment. better than what enforcement had used in the early years, improved after the policy failures in the outer settlements had produced enough administrative embarrassment that someone at the equipment procurement level had been allowed to do their job correctly. They fanned out with reasonable discipline, 6 in the primary formation covering the angles, 1 positioned slightly to the rear and left where the grain storage unit cast a shadow. The one behind the grain storage was the commanding officer. He moved with the flat economy of motion that distinguished people who had been in real operational situations from people who had only trained for them. She was standing in front of the stall with her hands visible and open at her sides, because it was the polite thing to do, and also because it gave her an unobstructed sight line in all 7 relevant directions, and because she had learned, across a very long career, that the posture that communicated no threat also communicated that you were not managing the situation from a position of threat, which was a different and more interesting communication entirely. The commanding officer came forward from the grain storage shadow. He was the rank she'd expected, senior enough to make judgment calls, junior enough to still be given operational assignments. He had a steady, deliberate walk and the kind of face that was good at not showing what it was thinking, which was a skill that took either training or experience to develop, and in his case, she thought it was both. He stopped 4 meters from her. 4 meters was standard de-escalation protocol distance. He had done the training. "You are registered as Mara," he said. "Bread merchant. Operating permit issued 11 standard years ago under Veth Reclamation Administrative Tier 4, which covers small-scale food production in designated market zones." "That's right," she said. "I have orders to request that you accompany my unit for an administrative verification procedure." "What happens if I decline the request?" He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing their words with actual care. "Mora, I want to be direct with you about the situation. We were not sent here for a routine check. We are here because the Administrative Office of Zone 7 received a flag from an automated biometric cross-reference system. A scan taken during your operating permit renewal 6 months ago was run against our identification archives as part of the new compliance protocol." He paused. There was a match. "What kind of match?" "A high-confidence match against a sealed Imperial archive." He paused again. "The file is associated with a historical subject of significant classification level." "How significant?" He looked at her steadily. "The file is triple-sealed. I was given access to the summary metadata only, not the full record." Another pause, and she could see him making a decision. "I was told the subject was involved in events at Kelsaris and at the Radiant Chain." She waited. "The biometric match flag included a specific identifier," he said. "A scar pattern, left hand between the 2nd and 3rd knuckle. The archive file contains a medical notation describing a blade wound in that location, sustained during ground combat at the outer ring of the Kelsaris installation. The wound notation was filed as part of a field medical report." He paused. "The report notes the subject sustained the wound and continued the operation without seeking treatment. The treating medic noted it afterward when the operation was concluded." She looked at her left hand. The scar was there, as it had always been. She remembered the medic, a young orc, barely out of training, who had found her sitting on a supply crate after the outer ring was secured, and had looked at her hand with an expression combining professional alarm and the particular embarrassment of a junior person who has discovered their commander doing something inadvisable. She had told him it could wait. It had waited. He had filed the report anyway, which was correct procedure, and she had told him so at the time. 42 years, she said. The report says 41. It was filed a year late because the campaign records from the outer ring were delayed in the administrative consolidation. The field medic's report is accurate. The date in the summary is wrong. The silence that followed that sentence was the kind of silence that has physical weight. She watched the commanding officer process what she had just said. She watched him understand that there was only one way she could know the report was filed late. She watched him understand what that meant. She watched him take a step back, and then she watched his hand begin to move toward his sidearm, and she said, "Don't." She did not raise her voice. She did not change her posture. She used the register, the particular frequency of command that she had developed across 2 centuries of leading armies in circumstances where the difference between a command landing and not landing could be measured in lives. It was not a threat. It was not an order. It was a communication of certainty so complete that the body understood it before the mind formed an objection. All 7 soldiers went still. 20 meters away, Senna and Patch had stopped mid-chase. They were watching from the gap between 2 stalls with the bright, careful attention of children who live in places where adults going suddenly still is a signal worth reading. "If you draw that weapon," she said to the commanding officer calmly, "I will take it from you. I am not threatening you. I am explaining what will happen as clearly as I can so that you can make an informed decision. If you draw the weapon, you will lose it, and then this situation will become something different from what it needs to be. If you call for backup, I will be gone before it arrives, not because I am trying to evade accountability, but because I am not going to stand here while a larger unit makes worse decisions than the one you're currently making." She kept her hands open and visible. "Or you can let me check on my bread and you can come inside and we can talk, like reasonable people." She had not moved. Her voice had stayed at a conversational level. She was fairly sure, just told the commanding officer of a Veth Reclamation Enforcement Squad that she could take his weapon and disappear at will, which was a statement that should have escalated the situation considerably. Instead, he moved his hand away from his sidearm, slowly, deliberately, with the controlled economy of someone who has decided that the available information supports a different approach. "Thank you," she said, and turned and walked back into the stall. They followed, of course they followed. What else do you do? Bot was at the back wall, monitoring the oven timer with the patient attention he gave to all timed processes. He looked at the 7 soldiers who filed into the stall's small interior, which was not built for 7 armored soldiers, and now contained 7 armored soldiers plus 2 civilians and a maintenance robot, and said, in his flat diagnostic voice, "The bread needs 11 more minutes." 3 of the soldiers looked at each other. One of them, a younger officer in the back, looked at the bread on the cooling rack as if it was the most disorienting thing he had encountered in an otherwise straightforward operational career. The commanding officer had removed his helmet. She had not told him to, he had done it on his own, which told her something. In the ambient light of the stall without the visor, he looked younger than he moved. He had the angular Veth facial structure of the Northern Hemisphere's regional populations, planes and sharp jaw ridges, and the slightly thickened brow that came from a few thousand years of adapting to a brighter sun. His eyes were a pale gray-amber color common in that lineage, and right now they were doing the thing that eyes did when a mind was running faster than the face was showing. A small secondary commendation mark on his collar, old style, long service, not valor. "You were at Siva's station," she said, 8 years ago. Left-hand operational platoon, 2nd rotation." He blinked, yes. The commendation mark. It was issued only to units that completed the full rotation at Siva's. The station drew its operational platoons from the Eastern Hemisphere command structure, and the left-hand designation meant you were part of the secondary containment perimeter rather than the primary security detail. She was moving loaves from the rack to the cooling board as she spoke, the motion of a practiced hand that required no attention. "Were you there for the relocation?" Yes, the final phase." "How many families?" He paused, 412 by the end. "The initial count was 603, she said. "That's in the official record, yes. The discrepancy." He didn't answer, which was an answer. She set the last loaf on the board, How is the station now? Decommissioned 2 years after our rotation, fully decommissioned. A pause. The site was cleared. Cleared, she said. She folded the cooling cloth and placed it on the board's edge. Yes. She turned to face him properly in the full light of the stall, and for the first time since they had entered, she let him see what she usually kept below the surface of the old woman's careful presentation. Not a threat, just the thing that was there, the depth of what was behind the gray hair and the leather shoes and the bread-smelling hands. It only took a moment. She put it away again almost immediately. He had seen it. His jaw had done a very small thing. Why did they send you specifically? She asked. Of all the available officers in Zone 7. He considered whether to answer. I was told I was senior available. The real reason, she said. A longer pause. The administrator who received the biometric flag is cautious. She didn't want to send someone who would follow protocol without thinking. She wanted someone who could make a call. The administrator is smart, Mora said. She read the situation correctly. The protocols for a historical subject of this classification level were written 30 years ago by people who assumed the subject would either be absent from the zone or would be found in circumstances that required immediate containment. The protocols were not written for, she gestured at the stall, the bread, the stool in the corner, this. So the administrator correctly identified that protocol was insufficient and that judgment was required. She looked at him. She chose well. He stopped, started again. What do you want from this? Sit down, she said. There's a stool in the corner. You're the only one who will fit on it comfortably. The space isn't designed for this many people. Your team can stand. She cut a heel from one of the cooled loaves and set it on the wooden board in front of the stool. Eat something. He sat. He picked up the bread heel. He looked at it for a moment, and she watched that moment, as she watched everyone who encountered the bread for the first time, because the decision to eat something offered by a stranger in an uncertain situation was a small thing that told a large truth about a person. He ate it. She began to talk. Not the whole story. 400 years was too long for a bread-baking shift. She told him the part that was relevant, the part that ended here, in a market stall, with 2 children who would come for bread ends at dusk, and a robot running his recycler diagnostic and an honest man on a stool eating bread he hadn't expected to eat. She had been born on a world that did not exist anymore. The planet had been called, in her people's language, a word that translated as the warm ground, a practical name for a practical people who had not yet learned that the universe was large enough to need impractical names for things. The Orcs were not, by origin, an empire. They were a confederation of clans that had spread outward from their homeworld through the same pressure that drives all living things toward more space, more resources, more horizon. They had been a people who built things and held things and passed them to the next generation with the understanding that the things would be built better and held more carefully. They had been, at their best, a civilization that valued what endured. They had encountered the Veth 290 years before the demarcation accords. The encounter had been violent almost immediately, not because either civilization wanted war, but because the space between them was contested and the tools available for resolving the contest were, at that period of history, primarily military. 100 years of the expansion. 100 years of the Veth counteroffensive. 90 years of the middle period, during which both sides bled so consistently that the bleeding became a form of background noise, something the political systems on both sides had learned to metabolize without being forced to stop. She had taken her first command at 22 standard years, young by her people's reckoning, where lifespans were long and experience was valued above all other qualifications. She had taken command of the combined forces at 46, which was younger than any predecessor, and she had been given the assignment with what she recognized, even then, as the desperation of people who had run out of other options. She had been given a war that was 190 years old and told to end it. She had done it the only way available to her, not by winning, not by the military victories she was credited with, but by making the war's continuation so expensive, strategically and economically, and in terms of the administrative burden on both sides' political systems, that the calculation simply stopped working. The siege of the Radiant Chain had not been designed to hold the Veth homeworld's moon. It had been designed to produce a number, a cost figure, a loss figure, a projected continuation figure, that no Veth administrator in the chain of command could approve. She had known this would take approximately 2 years. She had planned accordingly. The demarcation accords were signed 43 standard years ago. She had shaken the hand of the chief Veth negotiator, a human gesture she had practiced specifically for the occasion, because she had been told it signified good faith in human diplomatic traditions, and the human observers at the signing were the neutral parties whose presence gave the accords their legitimacy. She had wanted to do it correctly. She had walked out of the negotiation hall and gone to find the warm ground. She had already known it was gone. She had sent surveyors, who had confirmed it, early in the middle period of the war, not destroyed, but changed irrevocably by the resource extraction that had been necessary to fund the first century of the expansion. The planet was still there. It was just no longer the kind of place that the word home could be attached to without dishonesty. She had spent several years after the accords in motion, not fleeing, not hiding. The terms of the demarcation accords included an amnesty provision that covered the leadership of both sides' military commands. She was not a fugitive. She was simply a person who had won a war and lost a planet and had no particular coordinates to move toward. She had met Yusuf during the treaty negotiations. He was a medic with a neutral human observation mission, attached to the signing delegation to provide independent witness of the proceedings. He was small and wiry, with a habit of humming under his breath when he was doing something that required concentration, half-formed melodies that he said came from music his mother had sung, though he couldn't have told you the full songs anymore. He spoke 4 languages and had an opinion about everything, and shared his opinions without urgency, as if he were placing them on a table for inspection rather than advancing them as arguments. He had an extraordinary patience with ambiguity, which was not common in anyone who worked in military-adjacent contexts, and which she found, after a lifetime of being surrounded by people who resolved ambiguity with decisive action, profoundly restful. They had spoken every day for the 6 weeks of the negotiations. He had asked her, on the 4th day, whether she wanted to explain her strategic decisions or preferred not to. She had found this the most startling question anyone had asked her in several decades. She had said she would explain them if asked, and would also decline to explain them if asked, depending on which approach seemed more honest to the situation. He had said that was a reasonable position, and then he had asked and she had explained, and he had listened in the way that good listeners listened, not waiting for his turn, not building his response, just taking in what was said as if it mattered. He had come from Kessler's world. He had grown up in Dustside, in the lower quarter of the human settlement on what was then a mostly unremarkable agricultural world on the edge of the contested zone. He had described it with affection that was completely undefensive. It was a small place with limited resources and people who made a lot out of not much, and he had loved it in the direct, uncomplicated way of someone who had left, but had never needed to romanticize the leaving. He had gone back when his service was done. She had not known this until after the accords, when she had tried to find him through the neutral observation mission's records. She had gone to Kessler's world 8 years later. He had died in the interval, not in combat, not dramatically, but from the accumulated effect of a hard life in environments that asked a lot of the body. His last years had been in the settlement's small medical clinic, where he had continued to work until the work became impossible, and then had become a patient, which his colleagues reported he had managed with the same undefensive directness he had applied to everything else. She had found his grave in the cemetery on the eastern edge of what was now the Market District. The marker was plain stone. It said his name and his years, and a phrase in the human language he had spoken as his first language, which she had learned specifically in order to read it. The phrase said, "He was here and that was enough." She had bought the bread stall the following week. The commanding officer had not spoken for several minutes. He had finished the bread heel without appearing to notice it. His helmet was in his lap. His team was standing very quietly behind him, and she recognized in their stillness the particular quality of people who have understood, without being told, that they are present at something larger than the assignment they were given. "You built the stall here," he said slowly, "because of a human." "I built the stall here because of what he showed me," she said, which is a distinction that may seem small but is actually the important part. She looked out through the front of the stall at the market, at the fabric merchant and the bread smell and the dust and the pinkish sky. "He told me once, we were in the 3rd week of the negotiations, during one of the recesses, that his species had a problem with empty space. He said they couldn't look at it without wanting to fill it. He said it had probably been a survival mechanism at some point, when the spaces had predators in them, and filling the space meant the predator had less room to hide. He said they had never stopped doing it even after the spaces became much larger and the predators became more metaphorical." She paused. "He said they filled space with bread and music and children's names and ceremonies for things that had already happened. He said they wrote down the names of their dead and visited the places where the dead had been and told the stories to people who hadn't been there. He said it was the thing that would either save them or destroy them, and he had not yet decided which." A pause. "I have decided, but I have had more time to watch." "Which is it?" the commanding officer asked. "Saves them," she said. "Every time, not because it is rational, because it is stubborn. Because they fill the spaces regardless of whether the filling makes sense, regardless of whether the space was theirs to fill, regardless of what the accounting says about the return on investment. They fill the space and then they stay in it and they call it home. And it is extraordinary, and it is occasionally catastrophic, and it is the thing that nothing else we have found in this part of the universe does in quite the same way." She looked at him. "I have been watching civilizations for 400 years. I have not found a better operating principle than filling your space with what you love and refusing to leave." The quiet in the stall was the kind of quiet that follows something that doesn't have an obvious response. Bod at the back wall made a small sound, a soft cycling click, that Mora had come to associate with his version of clearing his throat. "The bread is fully cooled," he said. "The next batch is ready for preparation." She stood. "I want to ask you something," she said to the commanding officer. "Yes." "The administrator who sent you. When you report back, and you will report back because you're a career officer and you do what you are assigned to do, she is going to have to make a decision about what to do with me. She will send it up the chain. It will go to the sector coordinator. It will possibly go to an Imperial Advisory Committee." She looked at him steadily. "What I want to know is this. Are the people above her in the chain willing to read an honest account?" He was quiet for a moment. "An account of what?" "Of all of it," she said. "The expansion, Kelsaris, the siege, the accords, what each decision cost on both sides in specific and accurate numbers, what was gained, what was lost that could not be accounted for." She paused. "I kept records. I kept them very carefully, because I believed from early in my career that the record matters, that the reason civilizations repeat the expensive mistakes is that nobody keeps the real record, only the administrative version that makes the decisions look better than they were. I have a complete record. I would give it to someone who would read it." He was looking at her with the expression of a person trying to take the measure of something very large. "Why?" he asked. "Because the Zone 7 administrator is a smart person who sent an honest officer rather than following protocol blindly," she said. And that suggests there are people in your system who are capable of reading an honest account and doing something useful with it. And I have been waiting for 11 years in this market stall to determine whether that was true. She paused. Also because I am 412 years old and I have done what I came here to do. I have tended the cemetery and given away the bread ends and watched the children grow up. I am not running anymore. The record should go somewhere it will be read. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the market noise had built to its full morning volume, the fabric merchant, the chime from 3 rows over, the sound of the children who had gone back to whatever they'd been chasing. If I file an accurate report, he said slowly, it goes to the administrator, she escalates. The sector coordinator receives it, it goes above that. He paused. I don't know what happens above that. I genuinely don't know. I know, she said, committees, reviews, classified briefings that take 18 months to reach a conclusion, possible Imperial Council involvement if the classification level of the archive file is as high as the summary metadata suggested. She began prepping the second batch of dough. None of that is quick, none of it is certain, but it is honest, and an honest process at least has the possibility of an honest outcome. And if the outcome is, he chose the word carefully, unfavorable, then it is unfavorable, she said. I have survived unfavorable outcomes before. I intend to continue surviving them with or without official sanction. But I am not going to make your decision for you by running. This is your call. You are the officer in this room. He sat with that for a long moment. She needed dough. Bot ran his afternoon recycler check. The 6 other soldiers stood in the small space of the stall and breathed the smell of warm bread, and one of them, the young one who had looked at the cooling rack with disorientation earlier, shifted his weight slightly toward it, unconsciously, the way bodies moved toward warmth and good smells regardless of what the mind was doing. The commanding officer stood up from the stool. He tucked his helmet under his arm. He looked at her, and she saw in his face the face of someone who has just made a decision and has found that the decision, once made, is lighter than the weight of not making it. I'll file an accurate report, he said. Thank you, she said. He put the helmet back on. He paused with the helmet sealed and looked at her through the amber visor for a moment, just looked, the way you look at something you want to remember accurately. Then he turned and led his team back through the stall's front opening and into the market. She watched them go. Around them, the market continued its afternoon business, the fabric merchant closing a sale, the administrative drone on its survey loop, 2 more children she didn't know by name yet running through the gap between the north stalls. Ordinary afternoon, the kind that could be mistaken for peace. She turned back to the dough. At dusk, Senna and Patch and 4 others came for the bread ends. She gave them out in order of arrival, which was the fair way, and she ruffled Patch's hair because he was at the age where this was still tolerable if performed without ceremony. She watched them run back toward the lower quarter with their bread, and she stood in the cooling air for a moment with the empty rack and the stove beginning to cool and Bot beside her, running his end-of-day diagnostic with the thoroughness he gave everything. The commanding officer, Bot said, he will file the report. Yes. What happens after that is uncertain. Yes. Are you worried? She thought about this. 400 years of being asked whether she was worried about things, and the answer had always been yes. She was worried. She was paying precise and careful attention to the things that could go wrong. She was planning for outcomes that ranged from bad to catastrophic, and she was proceeding anyway, because proceeding was the job and worrying was part of proceeding, not a reason to stop. Yes, she said, I'm worried. Bot processed this. Is that different from how you usually feel? She thought about Yusuf, about the negotiations and the cemetery and the 11 years of bread ends and the starter culture working in the dark. No, she said. Not very different. She cleaned the stove with the care she gave it every evening and covered the rack, and turned the door latch its three-quarter turn against the wind. Bot went into standby mode. The market row emptied. The pinkish sky deepened to a darker color that the human settlers called dust dark and the Veth administrators called atmospheric interference. She walked to the cemetery on the eastern edge of the district. 12 minutes. The graves were as she had left them, simple and straight, the invasive scrub pulled back from between the markers. Yusuf's grave was at the near end of the second row. She stood there in the cooling air and did not speak, because she had never spoken aloud to a grave, on the grounds that the person was gone and speaking aloud was therefore theater. She came and stood and thought, which was a different thing. She thought about what she had offered, the record, the whole of it, the real account. She thought about whether the chains of command above a careful Zone 7 administrator had in them the capacity to receive something true and do something honest with it. She thought it was approximately even odds, which was better odds than she had faced at Kelsaris, and she had one at Kelsaris. She thought about a wiry human medic who hummed music and believed, with the complete and undefended certainty of his species, that being present in a place was sufficient justification for continuing to be present in it. She thought about the marker and what it said. He was here, and that was enough. She touched the stone once lightly with 2 fingers. The same 2 fingers she had used on Bot's chassis that morning. The same gesture. Not comfort, exactly, but acknowledgement. The world was large and indifferent, and the record might be read or might not be read, and she would be here either way, kneading dough and watching children grow and tending graves, and that was its own kind of answer to the question. She walked back through the quiet market to the stall. She set the alarm for the morning bake. She checked the starter culture, which was working in the dark with the patient, irrational persistence of something that had been alive for longer than anyone tracked and did not intend to stop. She checked on Bot in standby mode, a soft click of cycling systems. She lay down in the small back room she had built into the stall's rear 7 years ago, when her knees had started to register opinion about sleeping on the floor. She was 412 years old. She was 5 feet and 4 inches tall. She had hands that were large and scarred in ways that did not match the story of a bread seller. She was the most dangerous living thing within 400 light years, and she made very good bread, and she had a record to give to someone willing to read it, and she had 11 more years of bread ends to give away at minimum, and very probably more. Outside, the red dust settled as the wind came down from the ridge. The administrative drone completed its survey loop and began another. Somewhere in a Veth administrative office, a career officer was writing an accurate report, and the report would move up a chain of command toward people who would have to decide what honesty required of them. She did not know what they would decide. She had 400 years of evidence that the universe did not especially care about the preferences of individuals, however experienced. She had 400 years of evidence, equally weighted, that individuals who stayed in their spaces and tended their records and gave away their bread ends regardless of what the universe preferred had an unreasonable track record of outlasting the things that had tried to end them. She slept. In the morning she would bake bread. There were things she had not told the commanding officer, not because she was hiding them, but because the conversation had been about what it needed to be about, and some things were for the record and some things were simply hers. She had not told him about the year after the Accords, when she had traveled alone on a civilian transport through the outer territories that had changed hands during the expansion. The worlds that had been Orc-held for 50 years, then Veth-held, then Orc-held again, then finally allocated by the Accords to one administrative authority or another through a process that had involved many months of negotiation and had been conducted at a remove from the actual places that were being allocated. She had visited each one. Not all of them, that would have taken more than a year, but the significant ones. The ones she had been responsible for in one way or another. The places where her decisions had been executed by people following her orders, who had done what soldiers do when the orders are followed, which is to say they had done the necessary things and some unnecessary things, and some things that were the kind of things you don't put in the accurate record, because you can barely hold them in the inaccurate one. She had not told him how long it had taken her to learn to sleep again after the Accords, the specific texture of that, the way the silence of non-combat felt wrong at first, the way her mind continued to run threat assessments of every room she entered for approximately 2 years before gradually, it began to believe that the war was over. The body took longer to receive that information than the mind did. The body had been in a war for a very long time and had built itself around that fact, and rebuilding yourself around a different fact was slow work. She had not told him about the other orcs, the ones who had survived the war and the expansion and the allocation, and had tried, in the years after the Accords, to find places to be. Many of them had settled in the edge zones, the marginal territories that the Accords had left ambiguous, which the Veth administration was slowly incorporating through what they called normalization, and what the settlers experienced as a series of small pressures, each individually manageable, adding up over years to something that felt like being gradually enclosed. She heard from them occasionally, former soldiers, former administrators, people who had been part of the Confederation structure, and were now navigating the Veth's permit systems and tier classifications. They wrote to her because she was known to be surviving, because she was proof that surviving was possible. She wrote back, when she could, with practical information, which administrators were worth approaching directly, which forms were worth completing fully, and which were processed by automated systems that didn't read them anyway, where the enforcement patterns had gaps. She had not told him about the night in the 4th year when the lower quarter had lost power for 6 days during a grid failure that the zone administration had been slow to repair, and she had kept the stall open through all 6 days, with the old stove working on its emergency fuel cells, which she had been quietly stocking for 3 years precisely, because she had run enough supply operations to know that infrastructure in low-priority zones failed regularly, and the people who depended on it paid the cost. She had made bread for 6 days straight with Bot managing the fuel cells and keeping the dough hydrated by hand when the recycler ran low, and the lower quarter had eaten. Not well, but enough. She had not charged for any of it. The zone administrator at the time had eventually sent a maintenance crew, who had repaired the grid, and filed a report noting that the outage impact in the lower quarter had been less severe than projected, without asking why. She had not told him that the bread was better than it could be, better than it had any practical need to be, because she had chosen it as the thing to do excellently, not strategically, not for any reason that would have survived a rational accounting. Simply because when you decide to do a thing for a long time in a small space, it is better to do it as well as it can be done. And the starter culture that had been alive for longer than anyone tracked responded to care by producing something nobody could quite explain and everybody came back for. She had not told him that she had learned to bake bread specifically because Yusuf had mentioned, once, during the negotiations, that bread was the oldest form of human technology, older than writing, older than metallurgy, older than the wheel, and that it was the act of taking something raw and subjecting it to a controlled process of transformation, and that the result was always improbable. Flour and water and living culture becoming something that satisfied a hunger the ingredients couldn't have satisfied individually. He had said this in passing, in one of the conversation recesses, while eating a piece of bread from the negotiation hall's catering arrangement. He had not been making a point. He had just been thinking out loud. She had found afterward that she could not stop thinking about it. She had not told him any of these things. They were not the relevant parts, but they were the parts that explained why the relevant parts existed. In the morning, when the first batch was in the oven and Bot was checking the recycler, and the market was just beginning to stir to life outside, she thought about the report. Not anxiously. The way she thought about most things at this stage of her life, with the particular quality of attention that comes from having had 400 years to practice holding things that were uncertain. You did not grip them. You held them loosely, the way you held anything that might move on its own, and you paid attention to it, and you let it be what it was going to be. The Veth administrative chain moved at its own pace. It was a vast system, slow in the middle and faster at the extremes, designed by a civilization that had been managing 700 systems for a long time, and had developed the kind of bureaucracy that kept things moving without requiring constant attention. An accurate report from a Zone 7 reclamation enforcement officer would travel upward through that system and arrive eventually somewhere that could do something with it. How long that would take was a question the system itself couldn't have answered, because the system didn't know what it was receiving yet. She had thought, over the 11 years, about whether she should have done something with the record sooner. She had concluded, fairly consistently, that she should not have. She had needed the 11 years. Not to hide, the Accords gave her amnesty, and the administrative version of her biography was incomplete but not false, and she had not been hiding in any active sense. She had needed the time to understand what the record should say. You could not write the full account of a war you had just finished. The distance was part of the record's accuracy. 40 years of distance, plus 11 years of tending a cemetery and watching children grow, and being the fixed point around which a small piece of a settlement organized itself. That was the distance the record needed in order to be the real thing, rather than the defense of the person who had made the decisions. She thought she had the distance now. She shaped the loaves with the practiced motion of 11 years. Outside, the first vendors were cranking out their awnings. The chime from the north stalls had started up. Senna was somewhere in the lower quarter, probably asleep for another hour, and Patch would be up already because Patch was the kind of child who was constitutionally unable to sleep past dawn. The starter culture worked in its jar on the shelf. The dough rose under its cloth. The stove held its temperature at exactly the degree she had calibrated it to hold, a process that had taken 2 months when she first built the stall. Bot noted the oven temperature in his log and confirmed it against the previous morning's log and the morning before that. He kept very precise records. She had never asked him to. He simply did it because precision was what he was built toward, and he had found, apparently, that the bread stall gave him sufficient scope. She put the loaves in at the right time. The day moved at the pace days moved in Dustside. Not fast, not slow, at the pace of people doing things that needed doing and taking the occasional break to do nothing in particular, and watching out for each other in the way that communities in hard places developed, which was not formal and not organized but was real. She sold bread. She talked to the fabric merchant about a slow week and agreed it had been slow. She sold bread to a Veth administrative worker who came every 3 days and never made eye contact, which was not hostility, but the specific kind of studied neutrality that people in administrative positions in contested zones developed to protect themselves from the social weight of what they were administering. She gave the worker a good loaf and did not hold the neutrality against them. In the afternoon, a message arrived through the zone's open communication channel, not encrypted, not direct, in the format of a general administrative notice. It said that a biometric verification process for zone operating permits was being paused pending a review of the automated cross-referencing system, effective immediately. Duration of pause unspecified. She read it twice. Then she folded her cloth and began preparing the afternoon's batch. It was possible the notice meant nothing. It was possible it was a routine administrative adjustment that had nothing to do with one accurate report traveling upward through a bureaucratic chain. It was possible the administrator was buying time. It was possible someone above the administrator had made a decision, and the pause was the decision's shadow arriving before the decision itself. It was possible the pause was the start of a long process that would end with committees and classified briefings and imperial advisory consultations, as she had expected. It was possible it would end with something she had not expected. She had learned, a long time ago, to plan for the expected outcome and stay genuinely open to the other kinds. She would be here either way. The stall would be here. The starter culture would be working in its jar. Bot would be running his diagnostic. At dusk, Senna and Patch and the others would come for the bread ends, and she would give them out in the order they arrived, which was the fair way, and the day would end and the alarm would be set, and in the morning there would be bread. The universe was large and indifferent and full of spaces that someone, somewhere, was filling with what they loved. She had watched this for 400 years. She had concluded, with the certainty that came from very long observation, that this was the most important fact about the universe. Not its size, not its indifference, the fact that it kept getting filled anyway. She put the loaves in the oven and set the timer. She was home,